So, dear colleagues, welcome. It's my pleasure today to moderate the honorary lecture of Dr. Mariano Laplan, Executive Director for International Relations in the University of Campinas in Brazil. This university is one of HSC's closest partners in Latin America, as both our institutions are the members of BRICS Network University. We are elaborating since 2016. Moreover, University of Campinas is the leading university in Latin America, so it occupies the first or the second place in the international ranking, competing with University of São Paulo. And Professor Laplan is a top-ranked expert in Latin American issues. You can see his interviews on the web, on different media of Brazil, of Latin America, of Europe. So we're really lucky today to welcome Professor Laplan in HSC. So please, the floor is yours. And could you put on the PowerPoint presentation, please? So it doesn't matter? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Alina, for your introduction, and good afternoon to all of you present here. Thank you for attending this conference. I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to talk about Latin America, which, as you probably know, is a very important region in the world economy. We're talking about a huge territory, more than 20 countries, around 650 million people. Huge natural resources, and as you probably know, a very peculiar combination of wealth and inequality. Could we have my presentation now shown? Yes.
Можно, пожалуйста, презентацию включить? Okay. Yes, you have it. The lady will help you to
Okay, thank you then.
change.
Well, the title is Current Challenges for Development. There's a typing error there, but I don't have to go into the details. You probably know we live in a very challenging moment of the world economy. And Latin America, of course, suffers, is directly involved by all the tensions that are in the world economy in different dimensions. Could we please move on one thing? If we look around, we'll easily notice many sorts of disruptions, structural disruptions in every dimension of everyday life. In the economics realm, of course, there's always the potential of a new financial bubble exploding. Now there's also talk about a drastic slowdown in growth in the world economy. If we look to the political dimension of contemporary reality, what we'll see is political parties and institutions all over the world under intense pressure. Maybe the United Kingdom today is one of the most visible places where you can detect these tensions. The inability of the political systems overall to deal with critical situations where there are conflicting views in society about where to go to. If you look into geopolitical realm, then of course Brexit again, but the tensions between trade wars between the US and China, things that were probably not foreseeable 10 years ago. In society, maybe the best example, if the millions of people being forced to migrate because of civil wars. I mean, I could keep giving examples, but I don't think there's much doubt that we're in the middle of a structural change, a process of transition, because the direction that the world economy followed for the last 30 years is now being questioned. I think an easy way to put it would be to say that globalization is in crisis. Globalization was the path along which the world economy moved since the 80s. And it seems to have reached some important obstacles, or at least to have resulted in some unexpected phenomena. And we're having trouble dealing with these unexpected events. Now, but instead of looking to the past, if we look forward, then the question is, where are we heading to? Where are we going to? What's next? What comes after globalization? What's the new frontier? Of course, it's hard to guess. We economists are not very good at guessing. Most of the time, our forecasts miss the target by a way distance. But there are some predictable trajectories in this process of transition. Climate change, for instance, is here, and it will be with us for a long time. Social unrest, I'm afraid it's also here and will remain among us for a long time. Societies don't move rapidly, but when they do, it takes a long time for them to come back to a certain balance. And our societies all over the world are in the move. And of course, technology. Technology is path-dependent. So it's very predictable, unless you're in the middle of a scientific or technological revolution. But I think there are predictable trajectories in technology. Anyhow, the thing is that we are at a crossroads, and if you look at the options that are put on the table, there seems to be at least two. One could be described as, let's pull back. Let's pull back. Let's undo what globalization has done. Let's go back to a certain degree of the linkage of our economies, national economies, regional economies, local economies. That's Brexit. It's pushback, undo. The other option could be, let's push forward. Let's go ahead. Let's look for a new frontier that would allow us again to grow, that will put us away from the fear, from the shadow of long-run stagnation. And of course, this second option, let's push ahead, is in the mind of those who are betting on a new industrial revolution, of those who are betting in a huge technological transformation. Well, those are the crossroads. Yeah? We can see that from Latin America. I'm sure you can see it from here, because it's in the newspapers. It's in the language the world leaders, the politicians, use in the interviews. Can we move forward? So what about the Industrial Revolution, the potential, the incoming? Actually, some of the changes in the way we produce and we consume things are already here among us. It's not just a long, distant future. is something that is already happening. Why? Because some of the costs of producing, of taking to the market new technologies are becoming lower and lower. You will see on the left side the cost of genetic sequencing decreasing dramatically. On the other side, on the right side, the market for robotics expanding rapidly. So when you have costs falling and markets expanding, you're in the middle of a huge technological and market opportunity. Well, these disruptive technologies concentrate around basically two clusters. Digital technologies, like robotics, but also artificial intelligence, big data, cloud processing, whatever. And the other cluster has to do with new materials, either produced through nanotechnology or biotechnology. So these are widespread technological and market opportunities, and they converge, creating new markets. So far for the possibility of pushing ahead, moving forward, instead of retreating from globalization. You see, if this promise of a new industrial revolution materializes, in fact, could you move one forward, please? In a short while, we will have a drastic change in the landscape of everyday life and of business. Of course, this is a very expensive transformation. It involves big players. It is not for everyone to take part, even though not anyone will be able to stay away from the consequences of this. Can we move one more ahead? This is a very well-known image from the Industrial Research Institute 2016 magazine, and it shows who are the big players. The size of the circles, the colors are the region. Blue is Europe, yellow is Asia, orange is, blue is North America, orange is Europe, yellow is Asia. Well, you see the size of the circle is the amount expended by each country, both by the private and the public sector, on research and development in 2015. So it's very close. The place of the circle is a combination of, on the vertical axis, the number of scientists and engineers in each country, and on the horizontal axis, the ratio of expenditures in R&D to GDP. But let's look into the size of the circles, specifically on the only 2 and only 3 Latin American countries that are in the picture. The yellow arrow points to Brazil, the light blue arrow points to Argentina, and the dark blue arrow points to Mexico. You see, these are the only countries in Latin America that rank among the largest expenditures in R&D in a fairly recent year. So if you compare the size of the circles of these 3 countries, even if you add them up, you will realize that Latin America has not big players in this game. Nothing compared to the US, China, Japan, Korea. So what I'm trying to convey to you is that if this huge predicted transformation that's already happening goes ahead, Latin America will hardly be a leader. It will be a follower. Yeah? Nothing close to the giant players. Well, being a follower is not exactly something new in Latin American history. There's a traditional way to divide the world in the way Latin American economists traditionally look at the world economy. We used to talk, seize the 40s, seize the post-war. If you look at the document of the Economic Commission for Latin America published 70 years ago, 1949, it describes the world economy as composed of two groups of countries, the central countries and the peripheral countries. So this picture shows that we are not in the center, we are followers, therefore we don't make history, we follow those who make history. We follow those who bring transformation. We adapt. And sometimes over history, and I'm going to talk about that, we are able to do something more than adapt. We react. We are more creative. Unfortunately, not many times in history, but we're good followers. The thing is that we pay a heavy price. Part of the reason of this very weird combination of wealth and inequality has to do with the high price we pay for being followers, for not being able to take the initiative and make our own history. Okay, well, one more, please. Don't worry, there are not many slides. But let's look back in history for a while, and let me illustrate, or at least try to illustrate, this argument I'm putting together here, that we are not leaders, we're followers. Yeah? This comes from the very beginning of Latin American history. Yeah? Most of our history is the consequence of initiatives taken elsewhere. Yeah? In fact, we entered the world map as a consequence of the expansion of the European powers. Spain, Portugal, yeah? That was exactly what brought us into the picture. Yeah? These powers, not only Spain and Portugal, but mostly them, built here enclave economies, colonial economies, subsystems subordinated to the metropolis. Yeah? And that's how our economy started to be organized. Sugarcane plantations, gold and silver mining, so on and so forth. And we remained for a few centuries in this condition. Only at the beginning of the very early 19th century, we became independent countries. And that had to do with Napoleonic War in Europe. Of course, it also had to do with the First Industrial Revolution and the interest of Britain in expanding their trade networks. But let's move forward. One more. If we look into the late 19th century and the early 20th century, that's the age where Europe was taking advantage of the Second Industrial Revolution, then we once again faced a turning point. And these colonial economies became much sophisticated, complex, primary exports, commodity exports economy, we would say today. Actually, we still are, in a way. Not only that, but we still are. Yeah? This made us take a huge step forward. These small enclave colonial economies were not longer functional. New actors became important, American capitals, foreign and local, huge immigration from Europe, foreign investment to build ports, railways, infrastructure, expansion of urban markets. Very sophisticated economies compared to the old ones, to the colonial ones, but also very vulnerable. Also very vulnerable. Why? Well, because trade and business cycles were very closely linked. Even relatively efficient economies were specialized, not in one, but in many commodities, like Argentina, for instance, suffered immediately any setback in the world market. When wheat, meat, grain in general, wool prices went down in Europe, then our economy immediately started a downturn because we didn't have the currency, strong currency enough to import what we needed. And what we needed was almost everything. We exported commodities and imported manufacturing, fuel, whatever. Machinery, parts for the railroads, even coal. So these were very vulnerable economies. Sophisticated, but vulnerable. In the 20th century, turning points started to multiply. There were at least 5 very important turning points, similar to the one we are facing now. Yeah? One ahead. If you want to make questions or interrupt, please do so. Feel free. Let's look into the first turning point. That was the 1929 crisis. Not that the First World War was not a source of problems for us. It was. But it didn't last that long, and in the 20s, Latin American countries were already growing again, very rapidly. But the 1929 crisis, wow, that was something else. That was a profound crisis. It lasted long. Commodity prices went down. So this time, maybe under very severe circumstances, we not only adapt, but we reacted in a very creative way. We started to industrialize. Industrialization started in the 30s and lasted half of the century. With different paces, with different degrees of success, most Latin American countries somehow managed to industrialize. Of course, if you look to the large countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, they were the most successful. Industrialization lasted longer. It went beyond the easy substitution of imports. Brazil ended up producing heavy machinery, producing steel, petrochemicals, and so on and so forth. In the smaller countries, not so rich, industrialization didn't go that far. But somehow it was inevitable because you could not import. So you had to buy it somewhere or produce it. So import substitution was the name of the game. And itself, it brought industrialization, and import substitution brought the expansion of local markets. Urban employment expanded, urban consumption expanded. People moved now, not from Europe to Latin America, but from the hinterland to the large cities. From the north of Argentina to Buenos Aires, from the north of Brazil to São Paulo. Then multinational corporations arrived, and they brought, besides finance, by definition, they also brought some technology. So they were very helpful in accelerating the industrialization process. Again, we pay a heavy price for this, because unlike Asian countries, which took longer to industrialize, but they did it on their own, mobilizing their own private companies, their own business, we ended up being subsystems of the world network of affiliates of the European, American, Japanese, and now currently Korean, and now even Chinese corporations in manufacturing. So most of the income that is generated, or a huge part of income generated through manufacturing ends up leaving the country through the current account of the balance of payment. Dividends, remittances, technological services, trademarks. The other leading actor in the business sector was not exactly private business, were state-owned companies, because all those activities that were not very profitable or were too expensive, required too much capital for the private business or even multinational corporations to deal with, then the state had to take into its hands. So that's how we built all over Latin America state-owned companies. In the case of Brazil and Argentina, and Mexico, which are the countries that I know better, because I traveled a lot to them. In the case of Argentina, I was born there. State companies took over not only public utilities, electricity, water, transportation, railroads, they also produce steel, energy, petrochemical. These companies, which today are among the most successful, even though now they went private, were built with public savings. Society saved, paid taxes, and the state built these companies. This was a task very difficult. It involved a very sophisticated, organized state. That was the classic developmental state of Latin America, which you probably know already in the writings of Peter Evans and others. So this was a very important turning point, and we reacted to some extent in a very creative way, not only adapted. Can we move one? Let's go to the second turning point. The second turning point came in the 70s. Oil shocks, remember that? First 1973, second 1979. That was the end of the golden era for Europe, for the US. For developed countries, it meant a very uncomfortable combination of low growth, high unemployment, and inflation. That was the origin of in economic theory of a very important school, Chicago School, Milton Friedman. They had their moment in the 70s. But once again, in the 70s, Latin American countries, the Latin American developmental state reacted in a very peculiar form, because in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, which suffered the most this shock, oil shock, especially Brazil, because Brazil had to was importing all the oil it was consuming. And Brazil also, at the time, imported food. Brazil, in the late 60s, had an energy shortage and a food shortage, as well as Mexico. Argentina, not so much. Argentina had an energy shortage, but not food. Argentina was a huge exporter of food. Well, but the reaction was very creative. These Latin American countries took upon themselves, the developmental stage in these countries took upon themselves the task of implementing large investment projects in infrastructure, in food. Brazil created a state-owned company, Embrapa, which developed new seeds, new varieties of plants, crops that could be very productive in the Brazilian savannas. Because of this project, just to give you an example, in 20 years, Brazil moved from food shortage to one of the largest food exporters in the world. Brazil at the time desperately looked for oil all over the Brazilian territory. On the continent, it found none. There was no oil. At least not in the continent, but there were huge reserves of oil under the sea, on the seaside. The research project and the investments done in the late 70s in Brazil ended up 15 years ago making Brazil a huge oil exporter. Dams, electricity plants, huge petrochemical complexes, steel production was expanded. All of these things happened in the 70s. The golden era had ended for the developed world, but to some extent in Latin America, it was still going on. Unfortunately, things didn't end well. Because most of these projects, as you already know, were financed with foreign borrowing. Huge finance from abroad. Things seemed very manageable, but there was a new turning point, not very, completely unexpected, in 1981. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a meeting. Where was that? Somewhere in Europe, where the US and the European powers couldn't agree on how to revaluate the US dollar. The US was under pressure. The value of the dollar was falling, while the value of the European currencies was going up. And as a result of the inability to reach an agreement, the then Secretary of State of the US, Paul Volcker, left the meeting, went back to Washington, and announced a unilateral increase, huge increase, of the interest rate. This had two very immediate consequences. First, financial flows from all over the world start moving towards the US to earn these extremely high interest rates. The second consequence was felt in Latin America. We went bankrupt because we couldn't pay the debt that had been contracted in the 70s with very low interest rates. It became absolutely impossible to pay these commitments, financial commitments. So Latin America went bankrupt. First Mexico, then Brazil, then Argentina, everywhere. There was a certain moment in the 80s where most Latin American countries were under the supervision of the IMF. Well, we had high inflation, awful fiscal conditions. We were forced to take the economies into recession in order to import less and be able to export more to pay the debt. So it was a decade that became to be known as the lost decade. Almost zero growth, high inflation, high unemployment. Not everything went wrong, I must say, because we inherited from the late 60s and 70s a lot of military dictatorships in Latin America. And the debt crisis was also the crisis of the military dictatorships. So in a very rapid way, most dictators were substituted by elected authorities. Well, we didn't react very creatively this time. We adapted to a very critical situation. Maybe you could consider being able to regain democracy somehow of a creative response. I would be happy to believe that, but I must say that in practice it was more a consequence of the circumstances. The crisis in that sense helped us a lot. Can we move forward once again, please? Let's move to the third turning point, which was the arrival of the neoliberal agenda, which is, in other words, globalization. Actually, the neoliberal agenda arrived a bit earlier. It started in the UK, Margaret Thatcher, and also Ronald Reagan in the US. But globalization itself started in the 90s, after the Uruguay round of the GATT agreement. It was a consensus to change the trade and investment regime, treaties, agreements signed by almost everyone in the world, at least in the Western world, TRIPS. I know you're familiar with all these treaties. But in Latin America, globalization arrived through the hands of the Washington Consensus. It was an agreement between the authorities in the US, World Bank, IMF, the Treasury, that Latin American countries will finally receive debt relief with the help of these institutions in exchange for neoliberal reforms. So the developmental state was substituted by the neoliberal state, which privatized state-owned companies, opened economies to trade and foreign investment. This was supposed to bring, again, growth, dynamic economies, modern economies, foreign investment. Yeah? So I must confess that for most Latin Americans, these reforms were welcomed. There was a huge optimism about regaining growth, having the opportunity to follow the same trend the world economy was following. It was very adaptive. The idea was to do what everyone else is doing. The world was growing in the United States, so why wouldn't Latin America stay out of this? Let's move forward. I'm getting closer to the present, right? Let's move to the fourth turning point, and because the fifth is where we are now, the current turning point. So this is the last of the past, even though it's the first of the 21st century. Globalization was not a stable process. If you remember, in the 90s, we had some very severe crises, critical moments for the world economy. In the second half of the 90s, the Asian crisis. And in 98, Argentina had a crisis. In 99, Brazil had a crisis. So to some extent, well, in 2001, Argentina went bankrupt. To some extent, over time, this optimism and these expectations that neoliberal reforms that globalization had brought to Latin America started to erode. Because unlike what was expected, Latin America did not grow a lot. Certainly not as Asian countries, certainly not as China, certainly not as Korea. Asian countries took advantage of globalization, but not so much in Latin America. Yeah? After the crisis, Argentina, Brazil, and then Argentina again, when going bankrupt, there were some strong misgivings about globalization in Latin America. And it didn't last long. It didn't take long, sorry. It didn't take long. For in every election we had, in South American countries, even in some Central American countries, governments, political parties who won the elections were elected with an promising to move away from globalization, to fulfill the expectations that globalization had frustrated, to move away from neoliberal reforms, to do something else besides opening the economy, besides bringing foreign capital, besides selling state-owned companies, besides putting in place market incentives, something that could bring growth and at least reduce inequality. This was how in Argentina the Kirchner government was elected, in Brazil Lula government was elected and re-elected. The neoliberal agenda was put apart and a neo-developmental agenda was put in place. This, of course, took advantage of the commodity boom that started as soon as China started growing and building cities and infrastructure and moving people from the rural areas to the cities. Somehow, this phenomenon re-edited what had happened in the primary export economy. That was this one, the contemporary boom, was much longer and much important in income generating, but it somehow resembles the old one. Well, so Latin America started growing and reducing poverty and income inequality for the first time. This was something new. This hadn't happened before, because the developmental state and industrialization brought growth, but income inequality was not reduced. Industrialization moved people from rural areas to the cities, so there were poor people in rural areas and they became poor people in the cities, but poverty was still there. And this new developmental process, these new developmental states and governments succeeded, of course, helped by the commodity boom, to do two things at the same time. Of course, reducing social inequality was the consequence of income growth, but also the consequence of planned, intentional social policies. Huge investments in education, health, income transfer to poor families, an expansion of the pension system to involve rural areas, which did not happen in many Latin American countries before. So once again, some degree of creativity, some degree of reaction instead of just adapting, reacting to globalization. But I'm running out of time. Let's move back to the beginning. Let's move to the contemporary turning point. Then the fifth and last turning point is the 2008 crisis. The commodity boom ended. Then growth started to slow down, 2014. Very strong fiscal constraints resulted from the fact that governments tried to put in place counter-cyclical expenditures to keep pushing the economy, to counterbalance the slowing down of the economy. Well, slowly, after 3-4 years of recession, these neo-developmental governments start losing elections. and neoliberal governments were elected again. So, as I said before, we are again, at the beginning, we are again at a crossroads. And the dilemma is where to go from here. Back to neoliberalism? That's what the current government in Brazil and Argentina is proposing. Not very clever, I must say, because the world economy now is not the world economy in the 90s. A lot of things have changed. And what could be gained from opening the economy to trade and investment has been done already. Not that you couldn't move forward and open more, but I don't think there's room for being as optimistic as we were in the 90s. If not for other reason, because the 90s itself weren't that great. No? But then, what's the alternative? Forge ahead? Push ahead. But how? Because as I said, the world economy has changed. There's no longer a boom, a commodity boom there to take advantage of. Let's move on. Yeah? The world economy has changed, and I think there's no easy way to go back to the neoliberal agenda, but there's no easy way to keep pushing the new developmental program. Yeah? First, the world order itself is in transition. We don't know what will come after. As I said at the beginning, there are some trends, predictable trends. Innovation, social unrest, climate change. But what can we make out of that in terms of an economic strategy? So, given that there are new constraints, what are the opportunities? But what are the constraints that restrict our opportunities? First, the consolidation of markets all over the world has gone well beyond what we could have imagined 50, 40 years ago. Markets became global, and now you have global players. 2, 3 leading companies controlling huge markets. Some of these global corporations are larger than most of the national states. Our elites, those who are usually in charge of deciding what road to take, have become global, internationalized. They sold their assets, local assets, and they bought assets abroad. So the future of their business is not as linked to the national economy as it used to be. They have delinked. Some of them, the Brazilian millionaires, the Argentinian millionaires, they don't even live in Argentina or Brazil. They have beautiful apartments in the Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue in Manhattan, Paris, London. So not even the future of their families, their children, is as linked to Argentina, to Brazil, to Mexico, as it used to be 50 years ago. We can't look away from this. This is the new reality. National states, those who built state companies, those who took the initiative that the business sector didn't want to take, they're weak. As I said, first they have the fiscal constraints. Second, they have to deal with a highly polarized public opinion. Very hard to create a sustainable political base for any party in government, because society is completely polarized. If you please this side, the other half of the population will blame you, will kill you, will want you out of office. And there has been a strong institutional downgrading. We used to have a developmental state, then came a neoliberal state, now we have a dysfunctional state. Paralyzed. Because of this political polarization, fragmentation, and this lack of interest of the elite. Can we move? Stay on? Let me just give you two brief examples about Brazil to end my presentation. Let me go back to these predictable technological trajectories, the new industrial revolution, as I mentioned before. We run at our university, at my university in Campinas, in a partnership with other Brazilian universities, a huge survey asking more than 700 CEOs of Brazilian companies, either national or foreign companies in Brazil, how do they see their own company regarding this digitalization of production, these integrated, connected and intelligent production systems. We asked them, listen, in what generation of digitalization is your business, is your factory, is your firm? We gave them 4 alternatives. G1 is the lowest degree of digitalization. It's just standalone digital technologies. It's having a computer to run your administrative processes at the firm. J4 is the future. It's integrated platforms, learning machines, big data, analytics, so on and so forth. We asked them, what is the situation today, 2017? What will be the situation a decade from now, 2027? Look how the picture changed. From 2017, 1.6% of the companies, CEOs of the companies, acknowledged that they were working at that G4 level. In industry, 4.0. 1%, 1.5%. Look at the prospect 2027. Almost 1/4 of all the companies aim to be there. Yeah. So, as it's written there, by 2027, 65% of the executives believe that G4, the highest integration of digital integration of production will be, and business will be dominant in their sectors. We analyzed the data of these companies, their business, their assets, their market share. We classified them in three categories. The large part of them, the largest group, small SMEs, small and medium enterprises, could be classified as lagging behind. And what they should do, their strategy should be shorten distances to the production frontier. The question is, do they have the resources for doing this? Many few. Few of them have. The second group was the heavy industry, large Brazilian and large foreign affiliates in Brazil. Strong assets, very profitable. They do have the resources to follow international best practices. They will not develop these technologies, but they will buy and improve their productivity efficiency. There's a small group, technology-based companies. They're not large, they're small, but they're very intensive in knowledge. It's unfortunately a very small group linked to agribusiness, to space industry. They can move forward developing new technologies. Well, so this is the picture for Brazil, which is the most developed country, more sophisticated manufacturing sector in Brazil. And the question is, given this picture, can we in Brazil, using Brazil as a dummy for the rest of Latin America, the best scenario for Latin America, can we benefit from this new industrial revolution? If we had to decide whether to pull back or push ahead, pushing ahead meaning let's bet on this new industrial revolution and let's try to give energy to growth and income distribution through this, Does it look like we can do it? Does it look like this is enough? And the answer, I think this is the last one. Yeah. No? The answer is critical. Can disruptive technologies lead to a new stage of development in Latin America? What's the growth potential? Not for individual companies, but for the economy. What's the income distribution potential? What sorts of employment? What sorts of wages will this industrial revolution bring? And how about quality of life? About these three questions, I think that the most predictable improvement is in quality of life. Digitalization of public and private services will for sure make life easier for most people in Latin America. I don't know about growth potential. I don't know about income distribution, because we will be followers once again. And many companies and many jobs won't even follow. They will just disappear. So it's not enough to adapt. It's not enough to be followers of this new industrial revolution. I don't think it's wise to think about pushing back. We can't go back to neoliberalism, and we can't even go back farther to industrialization the old way, import substitution. We do live in a global economy. But if disruptive technologies will not take us where we want to go, then something else must be put in place. And this, I think, public opinion in Latin America, as I said before, is highly polarized. But if you could think of an image that could create some degree of consensus, I think the best image available is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. If this is the vision of development, and disruptive technologies cannot get us there, so who will lead us in another direction? I don't have an answer for that. And you could bet on business, state. Given the constraints, not very probable. Society, given its paralyzed, not very probable. I think we need strong and wise political leadership to build some sort of consensus, to decrease the degree of polarization, to put the state again to work, to become functional again, and to bring business on board, promising to grow again and reduce income inequality. I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Laplante, for a very detailed and brilliant presentation. Yeah, I see we have questions, but let me abuse my power of the chair and raise the first one, because it's connected directly to what you said. You mentioned that Sustainable Development Goals are the shared vision of the development, but as we all know, your new president, Jair Bolsonaro, made very controversial statements on it. He refused, for example, to host the conference on climate change in Brazil. So do you think something will change in the attitude of Brazil to sustainable development, or we still need to hope that he will change his mind and that you will keep going on sustainable development goals?
Well, I was afraid someone would ask that because I feel very uncomfortable commenting on the current president. How can it be? I said that there's a certain degree of consensus about sustainability in the way United Nations define, right? Economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. If so, how could this very, very peculiar person have been elected? I think the election of Mr. Bolsonaro is a mistake. And it's a consequence of political polarization. It's the consequence of frustration with 5 years of recession, 4 years of no growth, actually 2 years of negative growth. 2015 and 16 were the worst years in economic performance of the Brazilian economy since 1929. Since 1929, Brazil had not had 2 consecutive years of the economy shrinking. The current recovery is the slowest recovery after a recession in the last 100 years. We have 13% of the economically active population unemployed, which in Brazil means 13 million persons. Do that 13 times 4, supposing you have 4 persons in each household, and that will give you the number of Brazilians of every age that are under very severe economic stress. When I say that 30% is the rate of unemployment, that's the average. Because if you look to certain groups of society, like young people, it can go to 25%. And if you look to certain regions in the country, like the Northeast, it goes to 20%. So all this frustration, this economic stress, the lack of a political system to provide any viable answer, any viable solution, led, together with a very wise manipulation of public opinion using social networks, fake news and things that are part of any election nowadays, led to the election of a person who shouldn't be there. Yeah? Bolsonaro is the result of anger, frustration, and hate. If you're under very severe stress, you need to blame someone. It can be anyone. Your neighbor, the one in the car driving the car in front of you, the traffic jam, your mother-in-law, whoever. Someone is responsible of your frustration. And in the case of Brazil, the traditional political parties, all of them ended up being the culprits. But having said this, the opinion polls last week show that Bolsonaro, after 100 days in office, has lost most of his political support. The rate of approval of his government now is well below any other government in the last 25 years. So I do believe that the Brazilian society as a whole has a more positive view on sustainability than the current government. Well, it took long to answer because it needed some detail.
Thank you. Please.
Денисов Сергей Алексеевич, Екатеринбург.
One second.
Denisov Sergei, Ekaterinburg. Latin America got independence 40 years after. Latin America gained independence only 40 years after North America. Early 19th century, North America was as agrarian and rural as Latin America. What are the 2 or 3 causes or factors that did not allow Latin America to become North America? Thank you.
Well, that's a subject that has had a lot of attention from historians both in North America and in Latin America. And there's no one single factor that explains the difference. One for sure is that from the beginning, the colonial economies work in a different way. If you look at the North American colonies at the late 18th century, when independence happened, there were landowners on a huge number and scale that felt empowered enough to take the administration of their business on their own hands. While in the colonies in South America, both Portuguese, Brazil, and Spaniards, like the rest of South America, the economy was organized around enclave economies, exporting precious minerals, gold, silver, or sugarcane, huge plantations. And the colonial state was much stronger and controlled the economy to an extent that the colonial administration, British colonial administration in America, did not. The colonial state, both Portuguese and from the Spanish Empire, was much stronger, better organized, and had a control of the economy to an extent that the British government didn't have in their colonies. Besides, the conditions for taking advantage of independence were completely different, because the American colonies, the North American colonies, had a much better integrated two-way trade with England and with Europe, while in the case of Spain, Spain and Portugal both have the monopoly of trade. If you take the Spanish side of South America, all trade had to leave South America through 2 ports. One of them was Cartagena, and the other was in Cuba, and had to reach Spain in a single port. The customs had to be done in Sevilla. So control was highly centralized, while in North America it was decentralized. And trade had better opportunities for the North American producers than the South American. Actually, what led to independence in South America was the fact that they wanted to trade with Britain. They wanted to get rid of the monopoly that Spain and Portugal had. Actually, Brazil didn't get independence exactly this way, because if you remember, the king of Portugal moved to Brazil, running away from Napoleon. So for a while, Brazil, Rio de Janeiro was the capital of the Portuguese Empire, and the metropolis became the colony. And in fact, Brazil did not have independence through disruption. He was the son of the Portuguese emperor who became the emperor of Brazil, with the agreement of his father. So it was like a family business.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks a lot for a fantastic presentation of your lecture, and I guess it was very detailed and quite historical in the sense of the way we current story. I have two questions because in the very
Микрофон говорят надо. Микрофон говорят надо.
I guess I'm speaking loud enough.
No, it's for translation, probably.
You can come there and use this
Or
microphone.
I can actually just
Yeah.
a second, please. I'm just keen to kind of, all right.
Don't worry.
So, my question here would be just very brief, sir. I guess in the very beginning, the moderator had so succinctly talked about the idea of BRICS, and Brazil as one of the, the pillars of the BRICS. So with the present government and the mercurial president that you have chosen, how the BRICS position is going to be? As I'm told that BRICS is going to chair this year's BRICS summit and to host that. So in the present scenario, how do you see the BRICS position on the issues where it has been emerging and facilitating a new political order, a new multipolarity, and different kind of economic and political alliances, which is certainly not in consonance with Washington consensus? Thank you.
Thank you again for your question. That's a very important question, yeah. And once again, I must say that the president and his closest advisors are not completely, have not been completely successful in changing public opinion, business opinion, and even part of the government's vision that BRICS is something important for Brazil. Bolsonaro's group is adamant in bringing Brazil in line to the US interests. He went to Washington, he tried to become a NATO member, he offered the US the use of a space station near the Ecuador that Brazil has built. He's offering to allow U.S. companies to invest in sectors of the Brazilian economy that previously were not open to them. But this trend faces very strong opposition even within the government. Even within the government, for different reasons. Within the military, the military have always had an attitude of exercising some restraint regarding the relations to the US. Brazil has faced over the last half century restrictions to access to certain technologies that are critical for the Brazilian defense complex because the US has been against opening access to these technologies to Brazilian firms, which are key for the Brazilian military complex. But beyond the interests of the military, and every time the Brazilian Army or Navy or Air Force buys equipment, most of the times they look to European suppliers, not to the US, because of this access to technology issue. But beyond the issue of armed forces, for business in Brazil, BRICS is important. China is the main market for Brazilian agricultural and mineral products. It makes no economic sense to break relations or to create tensions in the relations with China. So this idea of breaking out with the BRICS group is not a consensus at all. So what I think that will happen is that before the meeting of the BRICS at in Brasilia this year, yeah, probably someone will put pressure on the president to keep his narrative against BRICS, against China, very low, to keep business going as usual. Now, if you ask my opinion, and I'm not in the government, for the future of Brazil, and I may say for Latin America as a whole, BRICS is important. It is very important for Latin America that Brazil leads its way out of the slowdown in growth and leads the way in reducing inequality. And Brazil cannot do it alone. It needs strong partnerships, and it doesn't make sense to choose. Brazil has some interest in common with Europe and also with the US, but mostly with BRICS. If you go back to that dichotomy, center and periphery that I'd mentioned, which is traditional in the way Latin Americans see the world economy, moving from the periphery to the center alone is very difficult. Not many countries have succeeded in doing so in the 20th century. Moving in a group, moving as a group, gives you some degrees of freedom, if not to become part of the center of the world economy, at least to differentiate yourself within the periphery. Brazil cannot do it alone. It needs China, it needs Russia, it needs also the rest of Latin America. It can be done. Not that our elites are too eager to do this. The Latin American elites are, to some extent, globalized, as I said before. And if they think they can take their business global, they leave the country in the periphery without too much concern. But if you do have groups within the elite that would like to develop the country in a sustainable way and to take it out of the periphery, to move it closer to the center, being in the center means gaining some autonomy, then BRICS is important. And Latin America is important. And Brazil is important for Latin America.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Скажите, пожалуйста.
What is your assessment of the consequences of the wide-ranging social reform in Latin America in 2012 and 2013, the policies implemented in the social area there? Can you say that those were only positive outcomes, or whether there were some negative outcomes that led to the the rise to the social expectations and the rise to President Bolsonaro in his election?
Thank you. You see, from the point of view of sustainable development, these policies were the right policies at the right time. In the case of Brazil, we moved around 30 million people out of poverty into standards of living comparable to low middle class. Yeah? That means they had access to housing, education, health, in much better conditions than before. Yeah? That's the upside. What's the downside? The downside was that, first, we could have done more. Yeah? So in some public services, like public transportation, should have improved much more. That, of course, would have required lots of investment in infrastructure. That was not there. Yeah? But the other downside is that all this upward mobility was anchored in economic growth, in employment, creation of employment. So this process of upward mobility is vulnerable. Economic downturns can bring these people out of the system, can deteriorate their living standards very rapidly, which in fact is happening. As I said, now we have 13 million unemployed in Brazil. The same happens in Argentina. So that's the downside. But there's something else that's very important, that's linked to the election of Bolsonaro. As I said, Latin America is a unique combination of wealth. Those are extremely wealthy countries, but extremely unequal. So there's very few wealthy people in extremely wealthy countries and lots of poor people. The consequence of this in society is that inequality has become part of a DNA of social life. Inequality is the basis of identity. Let me explain this. What I'm saying, I'm being very straightforward here, is for those who have, it's very important that others don't have. The identity of those who have relies in the ability of being different to those who don't have. This is critical for the middle class. I'm not a millionaire, but at least I travel by plane. At least I own a car. At least I do my shopping at a shopping mall. At least I don't cook. I buy processed food at the supermarket. So for those who have, it's very important. It's reassuring to see that others don't have. I don't know how things are in other countries, but I've been through most countries in Latin America, and once and again, talking to people in the middle class, talking to people in the... This is the narrative. Look what I have. This is my own merit. I conquered this. See how good I am. I'm not like those others who don't have. So, going back to your question, when you have such a rapid process of upward social mobility and people who didn't have start having, it spreads fear, insecurity, it weakens the identity of those who had before. So, what were the complaints of the middle class in Brazil, in Argentina? Look at the airports. They're full of people. Look at the shopping malls. People who are not like me. How come this low-income people walk the same corridors of the same shopping mall I do? I walk. This is my place. Go back to your place. So the idea that these popular governments were unstabilizing social order was very strong. And the middle class massively voted for Bolsonaro to get control of things, get things under control again. What good does it make for me to have this car if I'm in the middle of a huge traffic jam because everyone has a car? Take these cars of the others out of the street. This is what happened. Inequality is a disease. It makes sick people. It makes people sick. if we don't get rid of inequality, we will never be a civilized society. I know there's inequality everywhere, everywhere. But not to the extent, not to the extreme, not for so long as we had in Latin America. We had a moment, a brief moment of reduction, and it brought terror, fear to the middle class.
Thank you very much. And the last question, please, because we're out of time.
Good afternoon. I would like to express my gratitude for you to give us this lecture to us. And I have a lot of questions actually, but I will like to summarize my question in one question. It's like taking in account of this phenomenon that is happening in Latin America with the burning of this way of thinking that we don't have just right, but now we have ultra right like Bolsonaro, like Duque, like López Obrador in Mexico. I would like to ask you, which is the future of the integration in Latin America, and how the integration in Latin America will face the problems like we have in Venezuela, and the problem that we have of narco trafficking around of the region.
Okay, thank you for your question. Actually, I don't know if I can answer all these things about the future. Economists are not good, and we are not good guessing the future. But let me talk at least about integration. Integration has always been there as a dream, and it had its moments of moving forward and then moving back. We are at a moment of moving back. We were at another points in time, like the 60s and even in the 70s, and lately in the 90s, trying to build up regional integration agreements, like Mercosur, like that's not very feasible right now. As you say, as you probably know, the current president Bolsonaro is even thinking about getting out of Mercosur. Again, as I said in the case of BRICS, this is not a consensus among the Brazilian elite. Some people think that integration within Mercosur is important. Some people think that integration within Latin America is important. But at the moment, this is a minority. This is a minority. In fact, what has happened in the last 20 years is that all Latin American economies have integrated into the Chinese trade network. China has become the main exporter to the region, and in many cases, like Brazil, Argentina, the main importer from the region. China competes with Mexico, reduced Mexico's market share in the US because they were able to sell manufacturers much cheaper than Mexico, even though Mexico was within NAFTA. But now they're establishing some forms of cooperation with Mexico, at least supplying lots of parts so that the Mexican maquilas can sell in the US. But integration will always be there as something that is hard to build, but important to attempt. Integration in Latin America would require Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, but mainly Brazil and Mexico, actually, to take the lead in a way similar to what Germany and France did in Europe. But the challenge is much more difficult to face because, first, Mexico is already integrated in NAFTA, which Trump actually didn't dismantle, just bargained, and And Brazil is in the middle of this huge crisis. But maybe in 2 or 3 years we will be on the road, on the right track to integration again, not at the current moment. If I would talk about drug trafficking, that will take us back to a discussion of the state and the weaknesses of our state, dysfunctional state. Allow me not to go into those issues now, okay? Sorry.
So, yes, I think it's time to close our session. Let's thank once again Dr. Laplan for being with us. It was a great pleasure to listen to you. And thank you everybody for coming. And despite all this political instability and economic crisis, let's keep being optimistic. And as one of our brilliant HEC professors said, BRICS of all countries unite, so we will. Thank you.
Thank you.